All right, good evening and welcome to the second of three town hall meetings to discuss a school start time study that the Fayetteville-Manlius Central School District is engaged in over the course of the past couple of years. My name is Craig Tice. I am the superintendent of schools of the Fayetteville-Manlius Central School District, and I'm delighted to be joined this evening with Dr. Daniel Lewin from Children's National Hospital and Dr. Deborah Temkin from Child Trends, and they have served as our consultants. They have participated and held focus group meetings with a variety of stakeholders and constituencies. They followed that up with an interim report that was released in the summer of 2019, and then held set up a survey, community survey in the fall of 2019, of which they collected data and responses based on a variety of different options that you will hear more about tonight that could be possibilities. I have to say from the start that no decisions have been made. This particular topic was brought forth by members of the faculty and administration of our high school, and the Board of Education asked me to look further into this. And so the focus groups, the community survey itself, these town hall meetings, and then which will culminate in a final report by Dr. Lewin and Dr. Temkin, will give us some fodder for further discussions. Certainly there will be considerable lead time in making that decision. It is nothing that we're going to enter into quickly. And hopefully you will be able to have your questions heard this evening and to share some concerns or great ideas that we ought to consider going forward. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lewin to start us off with a brief presentation, and that'll be followed by Dr. Temkins.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Tice. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Danny Lewin. I'm a clinical psychologist, sleep specialist, and I've done extensive work on not only treating patients with sleep disorders at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., but also worked extensively with different school districts across the country on school start time change, healthy school start times. So what we'll be presenting here tonight is some of the background and the science and what happens when school start times change. And we'll also be, I'll then turn over the screen to Dr. Temkin, who will present on some specifics that we found in working with your community. It really has been an honor working with your community. I've gotten to know some of your administrators very well, Dr. Tice and others, and have seen your beautiful region and have learned a lot about your really rich and wonderful school district. I will say at the outset that I wear two hats, and I need to disclose this, and that is one as a sleep expert and with a life really dedicated to child health, and as part of that to sleep health and to public health related to sleep. So in some respects, I wear the hat of an advocate for optimal health. On the other hand, having worked with school districts, I also represent really all of you and all of the opinions in a community, because no change can occur and can occur successfully without there being a district being heard and understood. And so I hope you will accept that I can wear these two hats. And we really want to facilitate some wonderful conversation tonight, hear your concerns, hear your solutions, and we'll introduce a little bit more of that in a couple of minutes. But I will start by jumping into a little bit of the science and why this topic is even being discussed. So the DHHS, we're big on acronyms here in Washington, D.C., stands for the Department of Health and Human Services. Every 10 years, they put out a series of health objectives that cut across all domains from overweight, diabetes, cancer, et cetera. And back for 2020, starting in 2010 and for 2020, they included sleep objectives for the first time. And then they've increased those sleep objectives, which means that the government is very invested in and is hoping for improvements in sleep health and sleep quality across the population. So just to make you aware of what their objectives are, one is to increase the proportion of secondary schools with a start time of 8:30 a.m. or later. So they actually identified, and this is all based on science and based on data that can be collected across the country. The CDC has also been very interested in this topic of healthy school start times, the Centers for Disease Control, and they track how many school districts have changed and what the school start times are. Another goal of Healthy People Now 2030 is to increase the proportion of secondary schools with to increase the proportion of high school students who get enough sleep. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means, what getting enough sleep means, and give you some context for that. But this has, again, been identified as a measurable health outcome and a health outcome that is a high priority. And finally, one of the other priorities, and there are some for adults as well, is to increase the proportion of children who get sufficient sleep. And again, I'll talk about some of those numbers. Also, several years ago, in 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a position paper strongly supporting a shift in middle and high school start times to after 8:30 a.m. So 8:30 really being the very earliest that's recommended. And that was a recommendation nationally. And that has been a bit controversial in some ways, but on the other hand, this was a group who put forward this idea, and it was vetted and read and discussed for, I think, over a year by pediatricians all over and other health and epidemiologists across the country. So one of the most exciting findings in the field of sleep medicine, now called sleep and circadian medicine, was 3 years ago. The Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded to 3 researchers, and they identified clock genes. That's what they received the award for, which means that every cell in the body is regulated to some extent by clock. So what does that mean? That means when we sleep and the 24-hour cycling of clocks in every cell in the body are regulating essential physical function and mental function. You can just see here in this illustration that around the course of the day, and this is all science that has been identified, that their best coordination occurs a little after noon, and fastest reaction times occur early afternoon, highest body temperature in the evening, highest blood pressure, melatonin secretion, deep sleep occurs down here, lowest body temperature occurs around 4 to 5 in the morning, cortisol release, etc. So these are just a few of what really amount to tens of thousands of different functions that these clock genes regulate, meaning that when we're alert, when we're most able to learn, a lot of that is regulated by these clocks that are in every cell in our body. So what regulates those clocks to some extent is this one region in the brain, which is our master clock called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the first place light goes is in the brain is to that clock that resets our time. And that impacts when we eat, when we're thinking about eating, when we're hungry. But clock also affects our lungs, our heart, our muscles, our liver, our gut, everything in our body. And there needs to be coordination between all these body systems for us to function healthily. And that's why we begin to focus now, not just on how much we sleep, but when we sleep. The timing of sleep becomes absolutely essential for our health and well-being. There have been national studies done, national nurses study, about 10,000 nurses across the country. The findings of that study demonstrated that nurses who did shift work for much of their career, where it significantly increased risk of breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke, overweight, etc. So not sleeping at the right time has a biological cost for us as human beings. Now, there is variability, and we can talk a little bit about how the clock changes among different individuals, but also importantly across development. So I'm going to get a little bit more complicated. It's not actually all that complex, but I just want to explain a little bit more to give you some context for, again, why school start time changes have become an issue. So this illustrates two sleep systems. The system on the top, called process sleep, or the homeostatic drive, or what I like to call is the sleep appetite, or the sleep-atite, is that when we wake up, this is time across this bottom axis here, so 9 a.m., 3 p.m., 9 p.m., this is the sleep period down here, and then we wake up over here. So when we wake up first thing in the morning, we have no sleep load. That gradually increases over the course of the day, and is really at its maximal point before bedtime. We have a high sleep-atite, which we really do want to have. And then once we fall asleep here, our sleep-atite decreases significantly. So by 3 to 4 in the morning, actually most of it's gone. And we have a very, very low sleep drive by 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Which explains actually why a lot of people wake up in the middle of the night for an extended period of time. So that sleep drive has to coordinate with the circadian, with the clocks that I keep talking about. And here, as I said before, these clocks regulate tens of thousands of functions in the body across all organ systems. I'm just showing one here, and that's an alerting signal. So that alerting signal, controlled by the circadian clock, starts out very, very low in the early morning hours, then gradually increases over the course of the day. There's a little dip here right around what we call siesta time, when we naturally get a little bit sleepy in the afternoon. And then it gradually increases. So it's actually, the alerting signal is at a maximal point before we go to sleep at night, which is a little bit of a nasty trick that nature plays on us. But that actually is protective, because it keeps us hyper aware of our environment and what's going on around us before we go to sleep at night. So the problem here is that when you have a high sleep load and a high alerting signal, particularly in young children and in adolescents as well, we get very activated. Impulse control, we have what's called a burst zone where kids get super activated. So that alerting signal then falls off very, very quickly. And by the middle of the night, 3 to 5 a.m., it's gone, which allows us to reinitiate sleep in the middle of the night because our sleep drive is low. So you can see that if either of these systems are off, a little out of whack, if we're going to bed too late, if we're going to bed too early, if our sleep drive isn't high enough, we can get a lot of dysregulation in our sleep. And not just our sleep, but our circadian system, which is regulating all these other functions in our bodies and brains. One more kind of visual slide here. This shows the cycling of sleep stages at night. So we have 4 stages of sleep. Non-REM stages 1, 2, and 3, and then finally REM, which stands for rapid eye movement sleep, which is dreaming sleep. So we start at the beginning of the night, time again across this axis, 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., 8 a.m. We go from wake very quickly down to deep sleep. This is, again, that sleep-atite function. We have a high appetite for this very deep non-REM stage 3 sleep. Then we wake up a little bit and then go up to REM sleep for just a little bit, back down to stage 3, up to REM. All of these different stages provide very different functions. Growth hormone release during non-rapid eye movement sleep, cortisol during rapid eye movement sleep. REM sleep is involved. If we don't get REM sleep, the regions of our brain that regulate emotion are not well regulated. So if we are REM deprived, our emotions are poorly regulated. We become more impulsive. We also don't learn as well. Rapid eye movement sleep is essential for learning, consolidation of the massive experience that we have during the day. So here's the problem. So when schools start before 8:30 a.m. in high school students, you're actually cutting off their rapid eye movement sleep period. And they're losing a big chunk of their rapid eye movement sleep. And that's even more important because adolescents, and I'll say this a couple more times, their biological clocks are different than young children's and adults. Young children are larks. They like to go to bed early and wake up early when given the opportunity to do so. Adolescents can't. They shift. They want to go to bed later and wake up later. And again, that's deep biology. That's not just their preference. It's not because it's exciting to stay up late. It's really their deep biology that says they need to go to bed later. They cannot fall asleep around 9 o'clock. And then they need to sleep in some as well. And then as they age and we get into adulthood and even much older adulthood, then it advances again and we go to bed early and wake up early. So this slide, I'm not going to go through it all in detail. I can certainly provide it to your community. Provides some basic information about this is age. In this column here, this is sleep duration, sleep need. And then over here is the timing of sleep. So you can see here that infants go to bed at 6 p.m., but adolescents really are not prepared to go to bed before 10:30 p.m., even though they have to wake up sometimes for swimming practice, say, at 5:30 a.m. Very hard for them to go to bed early, and they're working against their internal biological clock. Adolescents also, older adolescents, still need between 8 and 9.5 hours, whereas younger adolescents still need between 9.5 and 10 hours of sleep. So there has been a lot of research on the impact of delaying school start times. There is also a whole other body of research on the impact of sleep deprivation and sleeping at the wrong times during the day. Most of that's in adults. There's some in kids. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of that, but just share some of the research. So sleep in adolescence, the body clock. As I said, all teens experience changes in circadian rhythms, their sleep-wake clock, associated with the onset of puberty, which actually occurs around 9 or 10 years of age. That seems early, but it's actually normal for the early puberty, for puberty to occur around 9 and for the clock to begin to shift at that age. So this results in a biologically based delay in falling asleep and morning wake times optimally for adolescents. Teens cannot make themselves fall asleep early. So sleep duration and timing are essential for health. I've already talked about the impact on nurses. It's also important for safety, productivity, and well-being. All of those organs that I showed can be negatively affected by not sleeping at the right time or not sleeping enough on a chronic basis. Adequate and appropriately timed sleep is as important as nutrition and exercise. And again, there's strong evidence for that right now. Sleep timing and duration impact. Adolescents who are sleep deprived are much more likely to report depression and more likely to have suicidal thoughts. Drivers aged 16 to 25 years are involved in more than 50% of the 100,000 reported police-reported accidents. So these kids are at increased risk of automobile accident rates, in part because they're inexperienced, but also in part because they're fatigued. They're not getting adequate sleep at night. On average, adolescents, and Dr. Temkin will show you some of this data in your own district, adolescents receive less than 7 hours of sleep a night, which is really problematic. And then multiple studies suggest shorter sleep amounts are associated with increased risk of obesity and many other health problems. So in school districts that have modified school start times, sleep duration increases between 17 minutes and 60 minutes for each hour of change in that district. So there are varying effects depending on how it's measured across different school districts. But the point is the kids do sleep more. There's also evidence that they're not going to bed later or waking up particularly. They are waking up a little bit later, which means that they're getting that healthy sleep in the morning, but they don't just stay up much later. Tardies and absences do tend to decrease significantly in a school district who has shifted their school start times. There are some studies, and this is varied, where there are improvements in grades and standardized tests, but that's varied. That's a complicated series of data. If there are questions around that, we can address why that's complicated. And then quality report of improvements from, that should be qualitative reports of improvements. So teachers say, in the morning, the students do better. Parents say, we have good time together and our kids are less surly. They function better in the morning and things are calmer during the day. And then finally, students in many of these districts also report some improvement in their functioning and their quality of life. So I think that is where I'll stop, and I'm going to stop sharing and turn the floor over to Dr. Temkin, and then after she speaks, then we'll get to questions.
So thank you, Dr. Lewin. Wanting to share a little bit about the process that we went through just to get a little bit of understanding of where the Fayetteville-Manlius School District is in terms of school start times and the perceptions that your community has. If I can get this slide to work, there we go. So we did a multi-phase study within your district, of which this is the last phase. So we started with a series of stakeholder interviews, and I will show you exactly who in a moment. We moved on to doing a community survey just about this time last year, and this is our final stage, really to get your feedback. So this is a very important component of our study, just to hear what concerns or hopes are from the community. So who did we interview? We went, and I should say this was largely Dr. Lewin, so I want to acknowledge that. But we interviewed several members, over 20, of the community, including all the school board members, the directors of transportation, athletics, curriculum development, facilities and pupil services, the heads of the teachers and bus drivers unions, school principals, athletic coaches, school leaders, and other community council members. So lots of folks just to get their insights on what are the things that we really need to be considering. And what did we hear? The number one thing that we heard was that there had to be community engagement in this process, that we needed to make sure that we heard all of the concerns, that we took those into account, that we built buy-in among the community, to make sure that if this change is something that the community is saying that you need, that there is buy-in to actually do that. We heard a little bit about the costs and logistics of bus routes, both concerns about current bus routes and students having to get on the buses fairly early to arrive on campus, as well as concerns about how to make those more efficient, especially if we're thinking about changing school start times. We heard about student mental health and the importance that many community members associated student sleep with improving student mental health, and really understanding the science, as Dr. Lewin just presented, around the need of sleep for improving student mental health. We heard a lot about childcare. I think this is one of the major things, and you'll see this in the survey as well, that there is large concern if school start times are shifted around, of making sure that the youngest kids in the community still have adequate childcare, whether that be with high school students, which tend to take care of younger siblings now, or other childcare options, and making sure that that is key consideration of how this might move forward. We heard a little bit about considerations of how to make the school day itself more efficient to allow for school start time change. So for example, moving to block scheduling and the implications both in terms of teachers' contracts for block scheduling, but also in terms of how that might make the day more efficient. We definitely heard about athletics, and this is something that we've heard across communities around school start time change, is concern around not only the ability for students to have time after school to practice athletics, but the implication of having your community be at a different scheduling than other communities in order to have games. We did hear similarly around after school programming and having time to do other types of extracurricular activities. We heard a little bit about the traffic and road safety, particularly around buses going in and out of schools and what the implications are for the traffic around those schools. And then we also did hear about nearby districts. So we had one example of a community nearby that is successfully implementing a later school start time for high school students, and other communities that may have differing schedules and the implications that has for your community. After we finished completing those interviews, we did field a survey. This was fielded just about a year ago, from October to November 2019. We had just over 1,500 respondents. And you can see by this slide that the vast majority identified as parents, and about 10% identified as school staff. I also highlight here that we had a really good distribution of parents representing the different levels of schooling. And obviously this does not add up to 100%. Parents have multiple children. And so this reflects simply whether they had a child at each of those levels, and they can appear in multiple percentages. So as Dr. Lewin mentioned, there is evidence based on parent report that high school students are not getting enough sleep in your community. And I should point out here that parent reports of their children's sleep tend to overestimate exactly what the sleep time is. So even here, we're seeing that on average, high school students are only getting about 7 3/4 of an hour, which again is likely an overestimate. We also are seeing a big difference with weekend sleep. So we see that high school students are sleeping for about 10 hours a night during the weekends. And this is something that Dr. Lewin and his colleagues as sleep researchers tend to refer to as social jet lag. They are trying to catch up on the sleep that they're losing on the weekend, which is not something that we want to see. We don't want to see that large disparity between the sleep they're getting during the week and the sleep they're getting on the weekend. We asked all the stakeholders on the survey what their current opinion of the high school start time is. And as you can see on the slide, every stakeholder group said that generally they viewed the current high school start time as too early. You can see some variation here. Elementary schools, parents who only have elementary school students tending to be the least likely to say that it's too early. But you can see, upwards of 3/4 of participants are saying that the current high school start time is too early. So we posed a number of scenarios to the stakeholders of potential ways that we could address the early school start time. Now, I will stress, as Dr. Tice has noted, no decision has been made. These are just examples and illustrated. These are not meant to say that these are the potential solutions. There are many other potential solutions as well. These were just ones that were posed to the community as potential options. So you can see here, one of the options is simply to flip the elementary schools with the high schools. We could have them all slide a little bit later. We could have them all slide later with a flip of the elementary and the high schools. We could try to condense the school start times so that middle and high school start times would be the same, or we could just leave the current start times alone. And what we found had some interesting patterns. So I'm going to first show you the overall results and then go a little deeper into the disaggregation. So here we see that there is a large difference of opinion. There was no consensus of which scenario worked best for the community. But the two that seem to emerge as the best, the flip or the slide and flip, you see also were the ones that emerged to the top for those that the community least wanted to see. And we understand this pattern a little bit more when we look at that disaggregated by the school level of children that the parents were responding for. So here what we see is that generally high school, the parents who only had high school students or had high school and middle school students were really in favor of the flip scenario. On the other hand, parents who had elementary school age students really were pushing for the slide and flip. And we see that pattern reverse in the least likely. We see that elementary parents with elementary school students really did not like the flip scenario. And the middle and high school student, parents of middle and high school students just didn't want to leave the current start time. And this is explained a little bit more in the qualitative data. So there are a number of potential barriers that we asked about and that stakeholders responded to in qualitative open feedback, including the number one that emerged was concern for elementary students waiting in the dark in the flip scenario. So there is real concern about elementary schools starting too early in those scenarios. So it really seems like the opposition to the flip scenario is the potential for elementary school students to wait in the dark. Now, there are lots of potential solutions to that, including making sure that that comes into consideration in any potential shifting of the schedule, but also investing in things like lights and wearables to make sure that students are able to be seen in the dark. We definitely heard about before and after school childcare as a real concern. We heard that stakeholders wanted to hear more about the potential end times and not just the potential start times. And I think this is important that there can be work to figure out and think through how long a day is, not only just when schools start. We did hear about parent work schedules. We heard concerns about how much this change was going to cost. And we heard certainly about after school activities and athletics, as we heard in the original interviews. And just some illustrative quotes. We heard from one parent that they liked the idea of moving elementary start times earlier, but not too early. So that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. But we generally heard something along these lines of we really need to think creatively, think flexibly to maximize our kids' chances for success. And this came out over and over in the stakeholder survey, that this drive to try to find a solution that's going to work for the community, respecting sort of the science evidence that Dr. Lewin presented before. So just to go over why we're here tonight, again, as Dr. Tice said, no decision has been made. This really is the final step of our process to create some recommendations for your district. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions about what we found. We want to hear any concerns you might have or any excitement you might have about this potential change that might occur. If you do raise a problem, one of the things that we ask is that you offer a solution. So if childcare is an issue, what are some of the ways that we could address that particular issue? We want you to engage either through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand and feel free to speak. Before we get there, and as you start to populate your comments or your questions, I have a few slides that will help us start to get that engagement using a software called Poll Everywhere. So to use this, you can either use an online browser or you can text. So if you're going to text, you text to 22333 and you enter Deborah Temke, DEBORAHTEMKI 335, and that will log you into this survey. And this first question, as you see here, is which best describes your role in the school district. And I know many people play multiple roles. School staff certainly have children in the district, but I encourage you to select the choice that best describes the perspective from which you are considering the school start time change. Should start to populate. Just a few minutes for people to log in. I'm seeing a couple of school staff, a couple of parents coming in. I'll give just one more minute for people to enter the answers here. Thirty more seconds. I'm going to move to the next slide, which is particular for students, staff, or parents, to report what grade level you represent. And I know that parents, as we saw in our survey, have multiple parents, multiple children in different grade levels, but I want you to name the one which is most, has the most implications for the school start time change. Great. All right, and the final question should populate a word crowd. Which is, what factors do you think most need to be considered in deciding whether to change school start times? So it's looking like childcare is a central concern. So I would really encourage, if you have indicated that childcare is a concern of yours, if you could think of a solution and raise it. We want to make sure that we are thinking as creatively as possible to solve some of these challenges. I'll give just 30 more seconds of this word cloud, and then we can start taking some of your questions and comments.
So I'll just say, while you're still wrapping this up, that again, we really appreciate your being here tonight. This can be a very, very difficult and contentious issue, and we raise this. We've heard a lot of the concerns of the community. We heard them in the survey. We heard them from stakeholders. What we typically ask in running these town halls is that when people comment, that they also talk about solutions, because what we're presenting is not a done deal, but we're presenting an issue that is being considered seriously. And raising solutions as well as the problem is also important, both for Dr. Tice to understand and for the rest of your administrators and for the community to understand whether that helps with understanding feasibility, but also helps people understand what can be done to make people's lives better. So as questions are streaming in, we will certainly ask for people. You can either put them in through the Q&A or you can raise your hand and you can speak them. I've received a couple of emails over the past couple of days as well with questions, so we'll get to those as well. Was there anything else you wanted to wrap up, Dr. Temkin?
No, I think we're good to move on to questions and comments.
Okay. All right, so let me just read some of these. What about parents who need high school students to watch younger siblings? What about high school staff that also have schedule? People's jobs are going to be affected. High school students have jobs, and it's ridiculous to even be considered. So these are all very, very common issues. And I think, again, as Dr. Temkin pointed out, and as we saw, the issue of childcare and aftercare are very, very important to consider for a community. In reality, in some of the studies that we've done across the country and looked at what actually happens when school start times change, is that people adjust very quickly. And it's really the anticipation of change that's the most difficult part. In looking at a district that we worked with here in the DC area, Fairfax County Public Schools, which is about 180,000 children, people were concerned about transportation, about kids working after school, and reality, and what we're talking about potentially for your district would be a 45-minute change. There is no loss of jobs and no loss of income. This is in Fairfax County. There is no significant loss of jobs or income. We've already discussed with your district the possibility of changing when childcare would be available with different groups. Dr. Tice can address that more. There are issues when, and particularly in our area, many teachers had 2 jobs. So this was initially considered to be a problem for them that they would not be able to get to a second job. So these are all very, very legitimate issues, some of which can be addressed or cured by responses from the district and reprioritizing certain issues. So I don't know, Dr. Tice or Dr. Temkin, I don't know if you want to jump in and respond to that comment.
Certainly, yeah, childcare was one of the issues that was raised not only in the focus groups, but in the community survey. I had a chance to reach out to my counterpart in the Webster Central School District. They made the decision to go ahead with a start time change, and they gave their community a year in advance to prepare for that. But they also worked with their town parks and recreation in terms of a collaborative enterprise under continuing education, where they ended up establishing child care centers right at each of their elementary school buildings. And so I know the community found great solace in the fact that that was going to be available after school for these working families. So that's definitely a possibility to try that out. We partnered with the local YMCA about a year ago to try to do that at the high school cafeteria using some of our own upper class men, juniors and seniors, to help staff that. And so that's a possibility in terms of working with other local agencies too. But childcare is definitely a main issue that's been raised in other districts as well.
And I'll just add that in the research that we've done in Fairfax, we did go and do some qualitative follow-up with parents and other community members after the school start time had been in place for about a year. And what we heard consistently was this sense of new normal, that there was certainly some concerns that they had, some hiccups along the way, and having to work out things that were even unforeseen, including things like making sure that there was adequate teacher availability after school and making sure that there was time in the schedule during school for students to go get help from teachers, for instance. But those were all worked out in that year of implementation. And all we heard sort of throughout the interviews we conducted was, yeah, this was a little bit of a difference, but it's normal now. This is our new routine. This is our new normal. And I think that's pretty common across school districts that have made this and other types of changes.
All right, so a few other comments. Why is it when I grew up, this wasn't an issue? All of this is insane, particularly during 2020 when there's so much, where so much is uprooted. So it's a great question. And then another question just said, the solution is not to change. So to address those 2 issues together, it actually was the case, and I'm making no assumptions about how old you are. I assume that I'm much older. But that school start times during the past 20, 30 years have moved earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. So it was not always the case that schools started before 8:30 a.m. So there has been this trend to move. One of the other issues is that the science has also changed. How much kids have to do during the day, how they learn. Those have also been changes. So that's why, and there have been many studies across the country looking at the benefits to health, to well-being, to academic function, mental health, quality of life all of these factors do change. So once the science came up to speed, both the circadian science, the basic biology, understanding the impact of insufficient sleep, but also the impact of different school start times, that's when this movement really started to take shape. So just a little bit of the history. So another comment, we need to take care of our teenagers. Science supported the changes should be considered. Another parent said that I wasn't able to post my responses on the poll, but I support later start times for high school students for the sake of student well-being. Another important comment, I honestly believe the average student or teenager, I got the gist of that, will see a later start time as an excuse to go to bed later, using the current situation as an example of those kids are now going to bed later than before COVID. So that is the case to some extent. What we found in other districts is that kids do adjust and they do go to bed later, but just a little bit later. What really happens is that they sleep more, which means that what they're doing is they're moving their sleep to the morning. And that morning sleep, where we get it, as I showed you early on, we get a very different kind of sleep in the morning hours. So that's very, very important. And it is a very common concern. Their sleep will just shift completely. During COVID, that is a great point. So now that kids have a lot more freedom in many cases to sleep in later, their whole sleep schedule will shift to a later time, again, because that's optimal for them biologically. So I hope I addressed that. Any other comments on that before I read another one? Okay. Are we considering the fact that students' sleep is affected significantly by screen time? It seems that many teenagers are up even later due to the increased socialization via technology. Maybe there should be an effort to educate parents and students on the impact of screen time. It's an awesome point, and it's super important for a few different reasons. First of all, screen time does two things. It's not only kind of addictive and engaging and exciting and competes with sleep, and we certainly know that from many studies, but the actual light that is emitted from devices, and whether you're online doing homework or whether it's on your screens, that impacts the internal biological clock, which further delays sleep onset and makes it harder to go to bed earlier. So that really is a significant issue. So yes, I would say education along with school start time change. In a paper that we published a few years back, we absolutely want education and more education about healthy sleep habits. So that really is a great point. The other piece of it that we've alluded to is that elementary school students, at least before the age of 9, are really prepared to go to bed early and wake up early. But parents often struggle with that, kids often struggle with that, but biologically they are prepared to go to bed earlier. You think about a young child who wakes up naturally at 6:30 or 7 in the morning, and their school doesn't start then till 9 or 9:30, right? What's going on in those 2 hours? And while we don't have good science around this yet, we're working on getting it. That 2 hours is likely highly productive learning time that's absolutely missed among those elementary school students, which is an issue. Okay, enough said there. Any comments?
The only thing I'll add, just around my child is going to bed later now, or my child will use the opportunity to stay up later. It is true that we see a little bit of shift later, and just based on the presentation that Dr. Lewin gave at the beginning, that's actually indicative of the natural drive for adolescence. Part of what we're doing is not just trying to improve sleep duration, but also sleep quality. So we know that rapid eye movement sleep is happening much more in the early morning. And the more we can promote that piece and give them a longer period in the morning to be able to sleep, the more able they are to learn and process, et cetera. So it's not just the amount of time, it's the quality of time that they're sleeping. And I think that's a really important piece, because you see the findings from some of these school start time studies where it's not, it doesn't seem like a dramatic increase of time. So typically, as Dr. Lewin shared, there's quite a variability between studies of how much time is gained, but usually around somewhere between a half to 3/4 of the time of the delay is what you see in the gain in sleep, which gives you some sense of how much later they're staying up. But that sleep is getting pushed later into the morning, which is much higher quality of sleep. So you can't just look at the raw number of minutes that a adolescent is sleeping. You have to think about that quality piece as well.
Okay, so another comment. I'm a working parent and I support later high school start times, which was followed by a parent saying, are the parents wishing for later start times generally working or non-working parents? And Dr. Temkin, I don't know, did we have that data?
We did not ask that specifically. I would encourage those who are online, if you are a working parent and you have concerns, please raise those. That is part of what this school start time conversation is all about. I will note that we had, quite high participation on the survey. And so I imagine that there was a mix. And we did see, again, that about 3/4 of survey respondents across the board said that they believe that the school start time right now is too early. So I think we have to put all of those pieces together to really understand. But again, if that is what you're feeling and there's particular concerns about being a working parent with the consideration of the potential scenarios of school start time change, please raise those and raise potential solutions.
So another parent, and again, Dr. Tice, feel free to jump in if you like.
Sure.
Another parent commented, let's see. The consolidate option looks attractive to solve childcare problems. Another parent asked, or individual asked, what would it take to have the kids back in school 5 days a week? I'm guessing, is that a COVID-related question?
That's a COVID-related question, and we've seen a lot of that recently. It's a requirement for us to be 6 feet apart. I just confirmed that with our Onondaga County Department of Health medical director today. Some people were saying that they'd heard it was less than 6 feet, and she reiterated today in a meeting with chief school officers that it is to be 6 feet. So that's one of the things prohibiting is we are using every available amount of space, given the square footage of our buildings. We do not have any additional swing space. So that is problematic right now during the pandemic. So if the Department of Health relaxes those guidelines in the future, we'd be more than happy. I know parents, students, and teachers would love to have the students back additional days of the week.
As a parent of a child who is now off at college, my heart goes out to all of you as a community, of the struggle of the administrators and parents who are dealing with this this horrible, horrible situation that we're in right now. So another comment, what employers are going to allow their employees to adjust hours? It's a great question. And, I can, Dr. Tice might be able to speak more to the variability in your community, which we knew a little bit about. But in Fairfax County, for example, we had every permutation of different work schedules. Some parents loved an earlier start time for elementary school students because of optimal childcare for them. The reality is that the needs across any district are so diverse. Some employers can be flexible. Look at how much flexibility we've all been forced to engage in during the past 8 months, unfortunately. And other jobs will not be flexible, and that's where different childcare options are absolutely essential. And my impression of work with Dr. Tice and others in your community is that that is a high priority to assure that they work closely with the childcare providers in the community to address those issues.
Absolutely, Dr. Lewin, and we saw that in the data. I mean, people resoundingly agreed with the research, but as you could see from Dr. Temkin's presentation, could not necessarily agree with the particular solution. And even with the current start times, you're absolutely right. There are needs both before school and after school for daycare options. It differs for every family. but there certainly are needs no matter what start time is selected.
I vaguely remember that there was also some discussion during the stakeholder meetings of there being high school students doing some work with and providing some of the childcare in some settings. I think that was your community, if I recall correctly.
Correct. And that was definitely on the home front. And then that was something we were exploring, as I had mentioned, with the YMCA, using our juniors and seniors who had an interest in becoming future teachers and had an interest in child development. The YMCA was giving them first opportunity to help work with our own Fayetteville-Manlius students at the high school. So it is something that could be rekindled if the need was there.
And then on this same topic, two comments that I'll put together. Changing childcare is also going to uproot the daycare, the childcare workers and employers' schedules. And then not everyone can afford the YMCA or other childcare for that matter.
Yeah, that's something that I think is going to be important to look at. We did a survey about the reopening of schools, and in that survey this summer, about 25% of our families indicated that childcare was going to be problematic in taking a look at the hybrid model for reopening. So we suspect that'll be a significant piece going forward.
And Dr. Tice, you had raised at our town hall earlier this week the potential for not only thinking about the start times, but also the end times and the length of the school day to better align the elementary schools with the high schools in order to promote the ability of high school students to care for elementary school students, et cetera.
Exactly. I mean, as you could see from the data that you presented, there wasn't consensus around one particular area. And so it really gave us pause for reflection to consider not only a flip and a slide, but also a condense right now. And that's what you're referencing. I mentioned to Monday's group that we triple trip our buses. And I think our mindset as adults is pretty fixed that we do the high school first in terms of picking up the kids, then the middle school, then the elementary school. And then we replicate that in the afternoon with dismissal. Actually, we don't triple trip in the afternoon, we quadruple trip or quintuple trip because of the enrichment period at the middle schools and the activity period at the high schools. So I think what we need to do is consider possibly double tripping. It would mean adding only a few more buses, but it would allow us to take a look at either by building level or by grade levels. It may be symmetrical, it may be asymmetrical. We can also take a look at not having it in that particular order. It may be elementary, then high school, then middle, and then dismissal could be high school, then elementary, then middle school. It does not have to be symmetrical at both bookends of the day. And sometimes I think we get a fixed mindset, and what we have to remember is the state, and this is something I mentioned Monday, still takes a look at the 180 days in the year, but it's looking at the number of hours of instruction, 990 at the secondary level, 900 at the elementary level. As a district, we are flush with the requisite hours at the elementary level. We're pretty tight at the secondary level. So in revisiting these start times, we could even entertain working with the fact that we have some elementary hours to spare that could be afforded to the secondary level to not only address sleep studies and start times, but also to make it more equitable across the board. So the possibilities are really endless, but thank you for bringing that up.
So another question, do you think you're preparing high school students for the real world, or they will have to get up early and potentially get up and go to work at some point where their boss or company does not cater to employees' sleep needs? Good point. I would say that the answer is that high school students are still have developing brains. Our brains are going through very, very, very active development up through 25 years of age, at least. And then it's different forms of learning. So that's one answer, that high school students are more susceptible, middle school students, elementary school students are more susceptible to to the effects of inadequate sleep duration and inadequate sleep timing. It's also the case that by the time most of those high school students get to working age, I mean, first of all, in college, students select their own schedule. So there's a lot of freedom in college. But once they do get to working age, their sleep schedule, their sleep need has shifted. It's changed biologically by the time we hit our early 20s and mid 20s. That early need for late to bed, late rise, that again is biologically based in high school students, that goes away, that changes. So I wouldn't say that we need to stress our high school students anymore, emotionally, physiologically, which sleep really amounts to, contributing to both of those domains. If we can do it, and there have been hundreds of school districts across the country that have shifted their school start times, I don't see that that's an area where we need to challenge them necessarily. Okay. I don't know if some of our staff can remove some of these answered questions as I sort through here. Okay, so I would say, so there was a comment that Dr. Tice was nodding in agreement. I don't know which question that was in response to, but I think we've all reiterated that this is not a done deal. This is a discussion point.
In fact, I wanted to show you I'm paying attention to your presentation. As you know, I mean, it isn't a done deal. In fact, another local school district with whom you worked did the complete study and certainly understood the research, but ended up not taking the mantle forward, and it could very well happen here. I think it's only fair to investigate and do our due diligence on this, and I think it'll be up to the community to make that decision.
So another comment, parent schedules don't change, why uproot them, and why pay attention to the nonsensical science? So, you know, as a scientist and a child health professional, seeing hundreds and hundreds of children a year who struggle with sleep, it is of course my bias and what I care about. I just differ on the science. I think that the science is absolutely there. I see the impact of insufficient sleep on children. I see the data nationally, internationally, that's very, very powerful. I know it's hard to bring that data home and relate it to what we do on a daily basis. It's very hard. And people's responses are variable. As I said before, or I alluded to before, there are some kids who are night owls who are really powerfully shifted. Sadly, we see very negative effects on those kids because they end up being labeled as either lazy or not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's like blaming somebody for having bad vision or not being a certain height or having diabetes, right? So some kids really are shifted and they really don't function when they go to bed later, when they have to go to bed early, and when they lose sleep and get woken very, very early in the morning. So again, I'd be happy to provide papers, dig into the science a little bit more, but really it is the case that science does kind of report on the general population, but that is it is very sound science at this point. Public health message from Centers for Disease Control, Department of Health and Human Services, pediatrics, would not be out there if the science wasn't there. It's good for my business to have early school start times because it impacts kids negatively. But that's not what I'm here for. I'm here for child health.
And I think this point addresses one other comment, which is, I did just fine with an early school start time. Why is this a problem? And you have to remember that everyone's chronotype is different. So among us, there are early birds, even in high school, who are up at 6 a.m. and completely functioning, and then there are night owls, and we are all different. And while there is definitely a genetic component of all this, your children may be different than you. So you have to put on the hat of, if I were someone who had the propensity to stay up later because I couldn't fall asleep at night, how would school start times have affected me? And I think that's an important lens to put on as you're considering the potential impacts of these things. There was another comment on here that I would like to address, which was questioning why we are not seeing as many significant results linking school start time change to improvements in standardized testing. And I think that actually goes to simply the complexity of the number of factors that are going into standardized testing. So when we're talking about doing those sort of statistical models, and this is, I didn't actually introduce myself when I started my presentation. I will note that I am not a sleep researcher, although Dr. Lewin has taught me a lot over the several years that we've worked together. I mostly focus on education research. So this is core to the type of research that I do. And what I will say is there is such variability in so many different factors that contribute to students' standardized test scores, that finding a statistically significant result in some of these studies, which have not included a very large N of students, can be very difficult. That doesn't mean it's not there. And we see many of the mediators, that is the pathways that we know are already connected to academic achievement, been actually significant results being connected to school start times, the biggest one being sleep. So actually, Dr. Lewin has published a paper on this showing that there is a causal connection between duration and quality of sleep and improvement in academic achievement. So we know that's there, and we can make that logical conclusion that by improving school start times, it'll improve sleep, which we know is linked to improved academic achievement. So those studies are ongoing. There are multiple going on right now. There are studies that have small effects. Some work out of Minnesota, for instance, some of the original school start time research that happened that did show links to improved grades. We actually found some improvement in our Fairfax work where we saw that for a student taking on average about 6 courses, we saw a 1-letter grade improvement in one of those classes statistically over the from before and after the school start time change. So those studies are ongoing. I think they, as we get deeper and there's more high quality studies in this area, we will see more. But just based on the research that exists, I think we can say that this does have a positive implication for academic achievement.
So so they're studying the impact of school. As Dr. Temkin is pointing out, it's complicated. But there have also been studies where they actually do experimental studies, where they adjust kids' sleep over the summer and look at their cognitive performance, look at their emotion regulation, et cetera. And some of those studies do drive to this point of optimal sleep timing and optimal sleep duration, contributing to optimal functioning and health. So it is harder in the natural environment, as Dr. Temkin pointed out. Another comment, I hope we can use creative problem solving to make this work for these kids' health rather than shut down the effort, because it's a challenge for families. We need to work creatively to find solutions to make it work, in my opinion. How would this impact our high school athletics? Does it just mean that everything would be shifted later? So I'll start by responding. This was an extensive discussion with your director of athletics. And we certainly have a lot of experience with athletics in Fairfax County. Basically, the different athletic groups, the stakeholders that we met with said, give us the time, we'll make it work for both practices and games. And Dr. Tice, I don't know if you had any more to add on that.
Certainly, again, if we're open and creative to the different possibilities, even if elementary is dismissed first, and then high school and then middle school in the afternoon, and we rethink enrichment and activity periods. Do they belong at the end of the day or during some other part of the day? We had committees working on this pre-pandemic, and so their work is not complete at this time. But if in theory, if we again look at a flip and slide and a condense and kind of use all the models together, there's still an impact in the afternoon in terms of interscholastic sports. But if the high school dismisses first, typically their games could be further away. The modified teams on a middle school dismissal later, they typically play more local games, so to speak, against their local counterparts within the area, so they do not have to travel as far. One of the things that was interesting when I spoke to the superintendent of Webster Central Schools is that cross country needed to work out on their field under the illumination of the stadium lights. They would still be running cross country, not track, so to speak, but that dusk, especially later in the fall, became a problem for the district. And so being able to run cross country where there was some illumination, even if it was on campus, was very important. So with the one school district in the area that is already using a later sports time, the other schools more than accommodate that particular school district and would so for us or any other school that would consider it. Believe it or not, it's not that far off than what it currently is now. Great question.
Okay, so by doing this, I will now need to pay for care for my youngest because my high school student won't be home. Does the district want to pay for that? Yeah, I mean, that's, people, for some people, this hurts their pocketbook. And that is the case, that some people end up paying more for childcare or have other challenges. For other parts of the community, it balances out. So, and I think what I've heard from your administrator, Dr. Tice, many, many times is that there is deep concern that people's needs are met. And that might mean different forms of childcare to meet people's needs. And if an individual is in financial need, particularly during this era right now, then my sense is that that does need to be addressed and does absolutely need to be a dialogue.
And that's exactly what I was trying to illustrate with Webster Central School, working with their town parks and recreation and continuing education, where there were scholarships available for certain families. Those contingencies were taken care of.
So another question, where someone is laying out the timing. So if school started at 8:45, my child would be getting up on the bus at 8:15, getting up at 7:45. That means going to bed at 9:45 to get their 10 hours of sleep. Actually, that doesn't sound like it falls into the scope of when they will get their best sleep, ? Also, I think we need to analyze why kids are not getting their sleep, homework, sports, jobs, reading, younger kids, clubs, video games, socializing, and media are not getting their sleep. Oh, okay. So they're not getting their sleep because of all these other activities, I assume is the point. So that is right, that high school students and middle school students do optimally need to sleep in later in the morning. But they also need, for the middle school students, 10 and a half hours of sleep is optimal. For the high school students, between 8 and 9.5 hours of sleep is optimal. So in the best of all worlds, all start times would be at 9:30 a.m., as kids often self-select for their college classes. It's not feasible. So we're working toward 8:30 or later as being a middle ground that's reasonable, that still gets high school students up at a time that's healthier for them and allows them to get to bed at a time when they can actually fall asleep. So if we bought more buses to consolidate middle and elementary school schedules, how much would everybody's property taxes go up?
Buses in New York State are purchased on 5-year notes. We receive about 72% aid on that. If the bookkeeping is done correctly, they basically pay for themselves by the time the purchase comes in. We have a good obsolescence plan in terms of retiring the buses with high mileage that would cost more to repair than it would to purchase a new bus. So you have to not just take into account the purchase of the bus, but the repair of it over the long term. So Our transportation department and our business office does a great job in that. And ironically, I'd like to actually say the number of buses because our transportation department has looked into this, but we need to finalize a couple of things. But I will say it's not as many as you would think you would need. And in part, I'm not trying to be flippant because while buses may be easy to purchase, so to speak, finding bus drivers has been problematic in the central New York area. So we do not want our reach to exceed our grasp. It isn't just a free-for-all in purchasing buses. We want to be very strategic about it because we will certainly have to hire the drivers to drive those buses. So the bottom line is we want to use a little calculus to minimize the impact to the taxpayer, but still be able to double trip instead of triple trip.
We published an article a few years ago, again, studying the whole country. And across different districts, there are a whole host of different scenarios that have been implemented. Some are zero cost, some are high cost, and some are savings. So there are actually lots of ways that things can turn out when schedules are adjusted in an optimal way to optimize the finances, the busing, et cetera, all the points that Dr. Tice just brought up. So another question, why does that extra sleep need to be in the morning? This is laughable. So it's a good question. So let me just say that adolescents relative to adults and young children, adolescents have a shifted schedule biologically. Again, it's deep biology. Their biological clocks push them to go to bed later and wake up later. And when they go to bed early, they're not getting if they can fall asleep, and they have to be pretty sleep deprived if they can go to bed very early. They're not sleeping at the optimal time for their internal biological clocks. You remember I said that we have clock genes, which means that every cell in the body has clock in it. This is deep, deep, deep biology. And if we don't sleep at the optimal time during the day or night, we're actually doing physical damage to ourselves. And we've seen that from, I referenced the Nurses' Health Study, and there are many studies that show the impact on insulin, on metabolism, on muscles, on brain activity, on brain development, et cetera. And then there's also the issue of rapid eye movement sleep in the morning. When you wake kids up early, you're cutting off their last bit of rapid eye movement sleep. And that has very significant effects and likely contributes to some of the causes of deficient sleep, inadequate sleep duration and timing, as being a risk factor for depression and suicidality. I'll just say that there was a fascinating study that was done, and you want to talk about hard love and being tough with these kids. There was a study that was done at the Naval Academy where they changed the wake times for these young soldiers in training. And the change in start time for those individuals had a really significant and positive impact on their accuracy in what they were doing in terms of military practices, in terms of their function, decreased injuries, et cetera. I mean, one of the areas where a lot of this research has occurred, interestingly, is right up the road from us here in Washington, D.C., at Walter Reed Army Hospital. They, as you might imagine, are very concerned about sending soldiers into the field who are sleep deprived in $20 million planes and $10 million tanks, and then the loss of life that occurs when people make bad judgments. So a lot of the science and the optimization comes actually that informs what we do and what we think about from exceptional research done in the military. Which is important to consider. They're worried about this issue of optimal sleep duration and timing. So I understand the spacing issue. Will this ever change? So I interpret that, I don't know, Dr. Tice?
I'm guessing that's in reference to the COVID. Yeah, we remain hopeful as vaccines and or treatments are rolled out that the Department of Health will adjust the 6 foot distance so that we can bring more students back to school. That's the game plan.
And there's a couple other comments, but I think I was asking, if COVID is still in, the impact of being fearful of sending children to daycare. I think part of that question is what the timeline is for the district in terms of thinking about this, making a decision, or if you even have a timeline at this point.
At this point, as I said, this is running congruently with a number of other committees that are out there taking a look at the high school schedule itself. So this is part and parcel, a piece of the entire puzzle. So this is nothing we're going to rush into. Those committees have to finish their work. Our facilities committee is taking a look at particular needs throughout the district. So there may be overlap. So this is, nothing that anybody has to worry about being foisted upon them right away. They will see this coming long in advance. So there is not a rush to speak of.
So another comment, you make it sound that the effect on families is minimal. If all of this was true, then why was every generation previously able to handle it? So again, good comment. We don't assume that this is easy on families in any way. This can be very, very tough on some families. On the other hand, it can be very beneficial for some kids and families. And we know the health imperative, the adjustment imperative, anticipating our experience, and what we've written about also is anticipating the change is monumental, particularly right now when everything is so out of balance and we don't recognize any ground that we're standing on right now and what to expect of anything in the next week, let alone the next year to 2 years. And then this also echoes another comment, but this was the same when I grew up. And I'll say again that school start times have gradually moved earlier and earlier and earlier over the past few decades. So it was not necessarily the case many years ago that schools started so early, and it was for a whole host of reasons. We can go into the history. I don't know that it's all that interesting. So there is that generational effect where actually schools started later, many, many years ago. And then I'll just say the other issue is that the science is now caught up with us, and technology, and the impact of technology also has an impact as well. Okay, so we still, just so that you'll know, we still have about 30 minutes. We have the questions are slowing down a bit. Keep them coming, or raise your hand and we'll call on you, and you can speak up with video and or audio if you'd like to. We welcome some FaceTime here. So the next question, I know they need 10 hours of sleep, but could you repeat optimal sleep times again for high schoolers? Yeah, so optimal sleep times for high schoolers, I can put up my slide if that would be helpful. If I can here. There we go. Sorry, that took a moment. Okay, so these are the optimal sleep times across the course of development. And you can see the way we've laid this out is that 6 to 7 years of age need 12 to 11 hours. So you can see that with age, there's a general trend for decreasing time. And then these are our estimates. This is not yet absolute published science. In the timing column here, this is in evolution, but this is pretty close to what we know and based on some initial science of when optimal bedtimes occur, when these kids can fall asleep or their optimal sleep times are. And again, I'm happy. I think, Dr. Tice, we can share some of the articles that we've referenced, and we can certainly share our slide sets. I know that this whole, all of these meetings are being recorded, and I assume that they'll be made available to the community.
Yes, on our YouTube channel. That's right, Dr. Lewin. That would be very nice. Thank you.
It looks like we have a participant raising their hand. So Shadon, can you grant Christine Porter?
Hi, Christine, you can unmute yourself now.
It looks like she dropped off. So there is a question, Dr. Tice, if this is going to be put up to a vote or just decided by the district.
I think there will be further conversations, and I think it would be memorialized in the sense of needing those additional school buses to be able to do any sort of a flip, slide, and condense to try to be able to pull it off. So the community will definitely have an opportunity to weigh in.
And there was another question. I just checked my email because a few of them have come in through my email. I'm concerned because our neighboring school district where my husband went, and I know, and where I know current teachers, kids miss the last period of the day and extra help in school and academics in order to make it to their sports, 3 to 4 days a week in a season. This happens now with the extra help. This happens now with extra help from some athletes who have practiced off campus.
And that's one of the reasons we're running with the committees at the high school concurrently. They are taking a look at the master schedule to see if there are efficiencies and things that we can do to improve that. So that is a concern we've heard before, and we certainly want to be mindful of that.
Some of the other efficiencies that occur that I don't know that we touched on, I think this came up on Monday, is that at least in Fairfax County, and I know we've discussed this with your administration as well, is that 0 period disappears, that rather than having kids arrive 20, 30, 40 minutes early, we're having an early school period where they have other activities, that would then go away. So that also facilitates some of the transportation, makes it challenging in some ways, but it also gets all kids there later and kind of equalizes when things start for different kids.
And that's a good point, Dr. Lewin, as I think I indicated in Monday's town hall meeting. When life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. Actually, the pandemic gave us an opportunity to rethink some of our bus routes. Instead of operating more of a wagon wheel format with the spokes of the wheel and sending the buses out to the far reaches and then having them come back to the center of the district, we're looking more like a target, concentric circles with inner shuttle, shuttles in the inner circle, more buses to the outer circle in terms of dealing with the pandemic and making sure that we could accommodate staggered arrivals and dismissals for the students. So that 0 period that you referenced at the high school, we were able to shorten up to make it more in alignment with first period starting and not having the students arrive too early and having to wait around for the start of first period. That's a good point.
All right, well, we can certainly wait a couple more minutes, or we can wrap up in a couple of minutes. There is one more town hall meeting this Friday the 30th at 11 a.m. I'd like to just really thank your district for having this very open, heartfelt dialogue. These are all important issues from our perspective as consultants. We are very concerned about people and families, and this works for people and is done in a way that is helpful. Implementation is another challenge, but there are lots of ways of doing that that can be done well. And just from my end, I'd also like to acknowledge Brandy and Shadon, our staff at Children's Hospital, who've done a great job, and from our conference services and setting us up and keeping us going here.
Well, thank you both, Dr. Lewin and Dr. Temkin. We appreciate your time. I think the questions tonight show the disparity in the community in terms of those in favor and those against. And there's a lot of issues that we have to work through as we study this and take it forward. So we appreciate your insights and the research. And I know you mentioned the one town hall meeting left, but we will look forward to your final report to close all of this out. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Go safely.
Yes, thank you to our attendees.